the most terrifying ancient civilizations. From forgotten tribes that shrank human heads to kingdoms that ruled through blood and fear, these are the most terrifying ancient civilizations ever known. Let's get started. The Moche civilization? On the dry northern coast of ancient Peru, the Moche built a world soaked in ritual and blood. These people worshipped gods who demanded human lives, and their towering temples stood as stages for death itself. The sands around them, it said, once ran red after each offering to keep their world in balance. Let's take a closer look at how this ancient civilization turned faith into something truly terrifying. The Moche lived more than 1,000 years before the Inca. They weren't one big empire, but a collection of powerful city-states linked by the same religion and artistic style. Each city had its own ruler-priest who claimed to speak for the gods. These rulers led ceremonies inside massive pyramids called huacas. Archaeologists have found that these places weren't just for worship. They were built to witness human sacrifice. The Moche believed their gods demanded blood to keep nature in balance. When the rains failed or the rivers flooded, they thought the gods were angry. To calm them, they offered human lives. Captives from rival valleys were forced into ritual battles high above temple courtyards. The losers, usually young warriors, were stripped, bound, and led before the priests. Their throats were cut with ceremonial knives made of copper, and their blood was collected in goblets to be offered to the gods. Paintings on Moche pottery show these exact scenes: priests holding cups of blood, warriors marching in chains, and gods watching from above. One of the most terrifying finds came from the Temple of the Moon near the modern city of Trujillo on Peru's northern coast. Beneath layers of painted walls, archaeologists found the skeletons of dozens of sacrificed men. Some had been decapitated, others dismembered, and a few left to decay in the open air. Their deaths were part of a system that linked faith, power, and fear. The people believed that only through it could the earth stay fertile and the sea calm. The Moche left no written records, but their art tells everything. On their pots and murals, they painted warriors, prisoners, and gods with fangs and claws. Even centuries later, their images make it clear that the Moche built a civilization where devotion meant death and every prayer might end in sacrifice. Next, we move from the dry deserts of Peru to the thick jungles of the Amazon, where other people found their own terrifying way to face death and control the spirit world. The Jivaro, Shuar. Deep in the Amazon rainforest lived a group whose name once sent fear through explorers and invaders alike. The Shuar, sometimes referred to as the Jivaro, were feared for their brutal raids and for something even darker that followed the fighting. Warriors didn't just kill their enemies, but instead kept part of them as proof of victory. But let's see how this mysterious tribe became famous for one of the most terrifying rituals in history. The Shuar were fierce, independent warriors who lived between what's now Ecuador and northern Peru. Spanish explorers in the 1500s wrote that they seemed almost untouchable, appearing and disappearing like shadows in the trees. Their rebellion against Spanish rule became legendary, especially when tales spread that they executed the governor by pouring molten gold down his throat, a brutal message against greed and invasion. But what made the Shuar truly terrifying wasn't just their skill in battle, but rather what they did afterward. When a warrior killed an enemy, he would take the head, not as a trophy, but as part of a ritual that tied life and death together. The Shuar believed every person had powerful spirits within them. If someone was killed, their spirit could seek revenge, bringing sickness or death. To stop that, the Shuar created something known as a sansa, a shrunken head. The process was both spiritual and gruesome. The warrior would carefully remove the skin from the skull, boil it in a special potion, and dry it with hot sand. The eyes and mouth were sewn shut so the vengeful spirit couldn't escape. The finished head, blackened and smooth, was then carried in ceremonies filled with chanting, dancing, and strong chicha gear. It wasn't about showing off, it was about control over death, over fear, and over the spirit world itself. Among their people, a warrior who carried a sansa was seen as powerful, protected by spirits and honored for keeping the balance. To outsiders, though, the image of these tiny shrunken faces staring back in silence became one of the most haunting symbols of the Amazons. Next, we leave the dense jungles of the Amazon and head to West Africa, where a kingdom built its power on rituals even more shocking. The Kingdom of Dahomey. In the 1600s, a kingdom rose in West Africa that would become one of the most feared in history. The kingdom of Dahomey in what is now southern Benin terrified its neighbors with its violent rituals, constant wars, and rulers who believed power demanded blood. Founded by the Fon people, Dahomey grew quickly through conquest. By the 1700s, under rulers like King Agaha, it controlled much of the region's coast and thrived on war and fear. Its armies were among the most disciplined in Africa, led by an astonishing and terrifying force made up entirely of women known as the Dahomey Amazons. They were trained from childhood to fight, kill, and protect the king. They marched into battle with chants that shook the jungle, and European soldiers who faced them said they fought with a level of ferocity few men could match. Every victory fed Dahomey's need for more captives. War wasn't only about land or trade, but it was about feeding the rituals that kept the kingdom's spirit alive. Prisoners of war were paraded through the capital, their fate already sealed. During the annual customs festival, hundreds of captives were sacrificed in massive public ceremonies meant to honor the ancestors and protect the throne. Witnesses wrote of drums pounding, songs rising, and the air thick with smoke as the victims were executed before cheering crowds. It was both a celebration and a warning, a display that reminded everyone of who held the power. For 2 centuries, Dahomey survived through fear and blood. But even after French forces finally crushed it in the 1890s, stories of its female warriors and its chilling rituals lived on. Next, let's head north to the vast grasslands of Eurasia, where the blood-drinking horsemen known as the Scythians people once ruled the plains. The Scythians. In the far north of the ancient world lived a group of fierce horsemen known as the Scythians, who ruled the wide grasslands from Eastern Europe to Central Asia, between the 9th and 3rd centuries BCE. These people had brutal rituals which stories claimed they drank the blood of enemies and buried their kings with human sacrifices. The Scythians built their world on horseback. Every man, woman, and child could ride before they could walk. Their horses were fast and deadly tools of war, trained to move as if they were part of the rider. When enemies advanced, Scythian arrows rained from the horizon, quick, silent, and deadly. They fought with tactics that made huge armies useless. Hit fast, disappear, and strike again. Even the mighty Persian king Darius the failed to defeat them, retreating in frustration when he realized they would never stand still for battle. But what truly terrified others were the rituals that came after the fighting. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Scythian warriors celebrated their first kill by drinking a small cup of the enemy's blood. They took scalps and sometimes even the skin of their foes, turning them into cloaks, quivers, or banners. They believed that by taking part of an enemy, they took his courage and power. In royal burials, kings were sent to the afterlife with their weapons, horses, servants, and even concubines, all buried alive beside them to serve forever. Their graves, called kurgans, still stand across the steppes, filled with gold jewelry, weapons, and sacrificed horses perfectly preserved in the frozen earth. These discoveries tell us the Scythians lived by a code where war, death, and faith were one and the same. They were a civilization built on fear, blood, and the belief that only the strongest deserved to ride beneath the endless sky. And finally, let's travel to the heart of ancient Italy and talk about the last terrifying civilization for this video: the Etruscans. Long before Rome became the center of the ancient world, another civilization ruled central Italy: the Etruscans. They were mysterious, wealthy, and deeply spiritual. However, what made them terrifying was their obsession with death and the dark rituals that surrounded it. The Etruscans didn't just bury their dead, but rather built entire cities for them, filled with paintings of demons and scenes that blurred the line between life and the afterlife. The Etruscans lived in what's now Tuscany, Umbria, and Lazio, and they thrived from around the 8th to the 3rd century BCE. Their cities, like Tarquinia and Cerveteri, were beautifully designed and full of art, trade, and religion. But their world revolved around signs from the gods. They believed every storm, bird flight, or animal organ held a message from the divine. To understand these signs, they relied on priests called haruspices, who read animal livers and other omens to guide every decision, from war to farming. To the Etruscans, death wasn't an ending but a dangerous journey. They believed the soul had to travel through a dark underworld filled with strange, powerful beings. Some of these spirits were helpful, like Vanth, a winged guide who led souls on their way. Others, like Sharoon, a hammer-carrying demon, waited to punish the wicked. Their tombs show these figures in vivid color: blue-skinned demons, winged spirits, and scenes of judgment that look more like nightmares than comfort. Their burial sites, called necropolises, were built like entire towns for the dead. Inside, the walls showed painted banquets and dances meant to celebrate life, even as they prepared for death. Archaeologists have found that some Etruscan funerals involve bloodshed, mock battles, and sacrifices meant to honor the dead and please the gods. Over time, these rituals inspired what would later become Rome's gladiator games. Even after the Romans conquered them, Etruscan influence never disappeared. Roman religion, architecture, and ideas about the afterlife came directly from them. But unlike the Romans, the Etruscans didn't separate beauty from terror. To them, death was sacred and fear was a part of faith. And that brings us to the end of our journey through the world's most terrifying ancient civilizations. If you enjoyed diving into these dark corners of history, make sure to subscribe.